The helicopter was already dying when Silas Corbett gripped the controls. Outside, the South Carolina coast disappeared into a wall of gray weather. Inside, the master caution panel blazed red. The pilot's shoulder was wrecked. The hydraulic system, the same one Silas had flagged that morning, the same one a man in a $5,000 suit had waved off like a nuisance, was collapsing one pressure bar at a time. The CEO sat 3 feet behind him, silent, her face the color of chalk. And Silas, the nobody, the maintenance guy, the single father nobody thought to ask, wrapped both hands around the cyclic and said the only thing that mattered: I have the aircraft. If this is your first time here, welcome, and please take a moment right now to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a single story. Every week we bring you powerful, emotional, cinematic tales about ordinary people carrying extraordinary weight. And this one will stay with you. Drop a like and tell us in the comments what city and country you're watching from. We genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now, settle in. This one is going to take everything you've got. The morning Silas Corbett's life changed for the second time. He was crouched beneath a helicopter with a flashlight in one hand and a grease-stained inspection form in the other, listening to a sound that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't loud. That was the problem. A loud sound gets reported. A loud sound makes mechanics stop and call their supervisors and stand around looking at each other with crossed arms until someone in authority decides what to do. But this sound was quiet. A faint, inconsistent hesitation in the hydraulic line, like a heart that kept forgetting its own rhythm. Silas held his breath and listened to it 3 times before he stood up. He wasn't the kind of man who panicked. He also wasn't the kind of man who convinced himself he'd heard something he hadn't. There was a difference between doubt and denial, and that difference had been drilled into him a long time ago in a life he no longer talked about. He wrote it down. Intermittent hydraulic pressure anomaly, lines 1 and 3. Recommend grounding pending full system inspection. Savannah Executive Air Terminal wasn't a big operation. It served the private jets and corporate helicopters of the business corridor between Georgia and the Carolinas, which meant it served people who had schedules and expectations and a very low tolerance for delays they didn't personally authorize. Silas had worked there for 4 years. He was 37 years old, 5'11", not particularly imposing from a distance. He had a daughter named June, who was 9, and obsessed with spelling bees in a beat-up Ford pickup that needed new brake pads. He wore the same style of work jacket every day, dark olive, Hawthorne Dynamics contract stitching on the chest. And if you'd asked anyone in that terminal to describe him, they would have said something like quiet or thorough or keeps to himself mostly. Nobody there knew what he used to be. Nobody asked. That was the arrangement Silas had made with his own life, and he'd been comfortable with it until the morning Conrad Vane walked across the tarmac. Conrad Vane was the kind of man who occupied space like he owned it, not just the space around him, but the space other people were already standing in. He was 45, Executive Vice President of Hawthorne Dynamics, recently profiled in 2 aviation trade magazines and 1 general interest business publication that had photographed him beside a helicopter with his jacket draped over his shoulder, like a costume. He moved with the particular confidence of someone who had spent years being agreed with, which is a different thing from being right, though Conrad had never fully grasped the distinction. He crossed the tarmac with 2 assistants trailing behind him and a phone pressed to his ear, already mid-conversation, already running late. The helicopter Silas had flagged, a Hawthorne EC-155, registration tail number November Hotel Yankee 7, used primarily for executive transport, sat on pad 3, fueled and cleared for pre-flight, except for the grounding recommendation Silas had formally logged with the terminal's maintenance coordinator 20 minutes earlier. Conrad spotted the coordinator first. "Tell me we're ready," he said, without removing the phone from the side of his face. The coordinator, a thin man named Ray, who had worked at the terminal for 11 years and possessed a careful survival instinct around powerful people, cleared his throat. "Mr. Vane, our avionics specialist flagged some hydraulic readings this morning. There's a grounding recommendation on file before we can—" "Who flagged it?" Ray pointed. Conrad looked at Silas the way people look at background furniture they're considering rearranging. "You flagged it?" Silas had anticipated this. He had the inspection form in his hand. "Yes, sir. Hydraulic pressure in lines 1 and 3 showing intermittent anomalies. I caught it on the pre-flight walkthrough. Could be a minor seal issue, could be something further back in the actuator assembly. I can't clear it without a bench inspection. Could be, Conrad repeated, with emphasis that made the word sound like an accusation. You said could be, so you don't actually know. What I know is that the pressure readings are irregular and the system is showing behavior it shouldn't show on a cleared aircraft. That's enough to ground it until we know more. Conrad took the phone from his ear and addressed the ground crew with an easy smile, the kind a man deploys when he's about to say something contemptible in a friendly tone. I appreciate the caution. I do. But I've been flying out of this terminal for 3 years, and I'm pretty sure this aircraft has been maintained to standards that are a little more rigorous than... He gestured vaguely at Silas. Whatever this is. Whatever this is. Not whoever you are. Whatever. Silas held the form steady. The pressure readings are documented. It's logged in the terminal system. Everything gets logged. That doesn't make everything meaningful. Conrad turned back to the coordinator. Get the pilot. We're departing at 9:15. Mr. Vane, if I could, 9:15, Ray. Ray looked at Silas. Silas looked at Ray. Neither of them said the thing they were both thinking because it wouldn't have mattered, and they both knew it. What Conrad hadn't noticed, because Conrad rarely noticed things that happened at ground level, was the woman who had stepped out of the terminal building about 40 seconds into the conversation and stopped near the edge of the tarmac to watch. Audrey Hawthorne was 30 years old, which was young for a CEO of anything, let alone a company with $2 billion in defense and commercial aviation contracts. She'd inherited Hawthorne Dynamics from her father 3 years ago and had spent every day since trying to figure out which parts of the machine were working and which parts just looked like they were. She had dark hair cut short, a way of going still when she was paying attention, and a persistent reputation in the industry for being difficult, by which people meant she asked questions until she got answers, which made her the most unusual executive Conrad had ever worked with, and privately, the one he found most inconvenient. She had seen the technician. She had seen the form in his hand. She had watched Conrad talk past him like he wasn't there. She didn't intervene. She had her reasons for not intervening, and some of them were good reasons, and some of them, if she was being honest, were about the billion-dollar acquisition meeting that was waiting at the end of this flight. But she stood there and watched, and she didn't forget what she'd seen. Silas walked back toward the maintenance bay. He logged the grounding recommendation a second time, once in the terminal system, once directly to the manufacturer's maintenance portal, which was a backup process most people on the terminal didn't bother with because it was slow and required a two-factor login. Silas had started using it about 8 months ago, for reasons he'd never fully explained to Ray, and Ray had never pushed. He was putting his inspection forms away when the terminal coordinator found him. Corbett, change of plans. How so? They need a technical specialist aboard for the meeting. Something about presenting a maintenance compliance brief to the acquisition partners. Ray looked uncomfortable in a way that meant he hadn't been consulted. Vane's office called over 15 minutes ago. I tried to reach you. Silas looked at him steadily. You're telling me I'm boarding the same aircraft I just flagged for grounding. I'm telling you what I was told to tell you. You don't have to... No, I understand. Silas picked up his kit bag. I'll be on the flight line in 10 minutes. He said it flatly, because there was no version of this that wasn't going to be what it was, and he had learned a long time ago that the difference between a man who survives and a man who doesn't often comes down to whether he can stay clear-headed in the space between a bad situation and a worse one. He walked to his truck first. He kept a small keychain on his bag, a painted wooden disc June had made at school, her name written in her own careful handwriting on one side and his name on the other. He moved it from the bag to his jacket pocket where he could feel it if he needed to. June was at school. She'd asked him that morning, in her particular 9-year-old way, whether he was going to be home for their spelling practice. I'll be home, he'd told her. Not I'll try. Not probably. He'd said it plainly, because that was the kind of promise he made. He'd been making it every morning for 3 years. He hadn't missed once. The EC-155 lifted off from Pad 3 at 9:22, 7 minutes behind schedule, with pilot Marcus Deller at the controls, Conrad Vane and 2 Hawthorne associates in the main cabin, Audrey Hawthorne across from them, and Silas Corbett seated near the rear, kit bag at his feet, watching the hydraulic pressure readout on the forward console from the only angle available to him. Marcus was a veteran, 61 years old, former commercial aviation, 2 decades of executive transport. He and Silas had worked together on the maintenance side long enough to have something like a professional understanding, not quite friendship, more the kind of mutual respect that develops between two people who take the same things seriously. Marcus had looked at Silas when he'd boarded. Silas had looked back. Neither had said anything that the cabin recorder would pick up. The first 20 minutes of the flight were unremarkable. Conrad held court in the cabin, talking loudly about the acquisition terms, about market positioning, about the impression they needed to make, apparently content that the unpleasantness of the morning had been resolved by simply not acknowledging it. One of his associates was nodding. The other was taking notes. Audrey was not doing either. She was looking out the window at the coastline below, the marshy geometry of the South Carolina low country, green and brown against the gray of the incoming weather. And then she was looking at Silas, and before Silas had fully registered that she'd turned toward him, she spoke. "Can I ask you something?" He met her eyes. "Go ahead." "Why avionics?" She said it like it was a genuine question, not small talk. Someone with your level of technical knowledge. You could be in any number of positions that don't involve crawling under aircraft at 6 in the morning. Silas considered the question. It was more complicated than she probably meant it to be, but he didn't say that. "I like the work," he said. "I like being close to the machine. You know exactly what it's telling you or you don't. There's not a lot of interpretation involved." "Conrad interprets everything," she said quietly. Silas didn't respond to that. "You have a daughter," she said. It wasn't a question. She'd either read his personnel file or overheard something. "June, 9 years old." "What's she like?" The question caught him somewhere unexpected. People asked about June the way people asked about pets, as a conversational gesture, a way of being polite. The way Audrey asked it was different. She was looking at him like she actually wanted to know. He stopped, started again. "She takes everything seriously. Her spelling practice, her friendships, what she eats for breakfast. She has opinions about things most kids don't think about twice. She worries sometimes, but when she decides she trusts something, she commits to it completely." He paused. "She's better than I deserve." Audrey absorbed that. "You left something to raise her." It wasn't a question either. "Some things matter more than a title," Silas said. She watched him for another moment, then turned back to the window. 3 minutes later, Silas felt it. Not heard. Felt. A vibration in the seat pan, subtle and irregular, a few degrees off from the normal harmonic frequency of the rotor system. He'd spent enough hours in enough aircraft, military and civilian, rotary and fixed wing, to know the difference between a vibration that belonged and one that didn't. This one didn't belong. He leaned forward, checked the console from his angle. The hydraulic pressure gauge was fluctuating, not dramatically, not yet, but it was moving in a range it had no business being in at normal cruise. His jaw tightened. The master caution system registered it 5 seconds later. The amber light on the forward panel lit up like an accusation. From the cockpit, Marcus's voice came through, controlled but not relaxed. "Cabin, I have a hydraulic caution light. Working the checklist." Conrad's conversation stopped. Silas was already out of his seat. He moved forward without asking permission because asking permission was not something the moment had time for. In the cockpit, Marcus had the checklist open and his hands on both controls, and his left shoulder was already wrong, the way he was holding it, compensating for something. Silas clocked that in the first second. "What happened to your shoulder?" Silas said low. "Caught the collective on that downdraft a minute ago." Marcus's voice was steady, but his face was pale. "It's manageable." It wasn't manageable. Silas could see that. The muscle had seized. The weather that had been building to the east was on them now, gray and close, visibility dropping. "What's your hydraulic reading?" "System 1 is at 40% and dropping. System 2 is nominal, but..." Another fluctuation. "System 2 just stepped down." Both systems. The thing Silas had warned them about. He looked at Marcus's shoulder, then at the controls, then at the coastline below. Residential, dense, the rooftops of neighborhoods stacked one against the other. "Marcus," Silas said. The pilot looked at him. And Silas Corbett, who had not told a single person at that terminal what he used to be, made the only decision available to him. He reached forward and wrapped both hands around the cyclic. I have the aircraft. Marcus didn't argue. Some part of a veteran's instinct knows when to trust another set of trained hands, even when those hands have never explained themselves. You have the aircraft, Marcus confirmed. In the cabin, Conrad Vane had started to say something. Silas blocked it out completely, the way he'd been trained to block things out, the way he'd spent years trying to forget he still could. The helicopter was sick, and it was falling, and the coast was below, and the weather was closing in. And Silas Corbett had it. Part 2. Louis, viết du 9500 chắc tù liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hội thoại, tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lan man, nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hội thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình. Viết như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sàng. Có yếu tố con người, cấm miêu tả qua mượt mà và hoàn hảo, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau, câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa. Louis trả lời trong mục tin nhận không nhảy sang document. Chi đan bắt buộc không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyền. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí, không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật. Không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Lưu ý đặc biệt quan trọng. Nếu đạt đến giới hạn trả lời, không được dung giữa câu hay viết nốt câu đó hoàn chỉnh không mở rộng nội dung. Part 2. The helicopter bucked once, hard, as if the sky itself had flinched. Silas absorbed the movement through his hands and hips, the way a rider absorbs a stumble from a horse, not fighting it, reading it, letting the machine tell him what it needed. The cyclic shuddered against his palm. The collective felt sluggish, the hydraulic assistance already reduced to something closer to a suggestion than a system. He'd felt degraded hydraulics before, not in a corporate EC-155 over a residential coastline, but the physics didn't care about context. Behind him, in the cabin, someone had made a sharp sound that was almost a word. He didn't turn around. Marcus. His voice was even. Talk to me about your systems. What are you showing on 2? Marcus Deller had both hands resting near the controls but not gripping them, the practiced posture of a co-pilot deferring to a more capable set of hands while staying available. His left shoulder was clearly wrong. The way he was carrying it, slightly forward and low, suggested a muscle seize rather than a structural injury, which meant it would get worse before it got better. And it was already bad enough that he couldn't have managed the control inputs the situation was going to demand. System 2 is at 61% and trending down, Marcus said. Rate of loss is slower than 1, but it's not stabilizing. He checked the readout again. 60. Tail rotor authority. Reduced, not gone. But if we lose another 10 points, I know. Silas didn't need him to finish. Below them, through the windscreen, the South Carolina coast rolled past in patches of gray-green. Wetlands, then rooftops, then more wetlands, then a cluster of roads that fed into what looked like a mid-sized town. The weather that had been building to the east had arrived, not as a sudden storm, but as a closing ceiling, cloud pressing down toward the water like a lid being set on a pot. Visibility was dropping. He keyed the radio with his left hand, keeping his right on the cyclic. Approach. This is Hawthorne, November Hotel Yankee 7. Declaring emergency. We have dual hydraulic degradation and a flight crew injury. Requesting priority handling. The response came back in under 4 seconds, which was either a slow or fast 4 seconds, depending on how you were spending it. November Hotel Yankee 7. Approach copies your emergency. Squawk 7700. What are your intentions? Silas was already thinking 2 steps past that question. He'd been building a mental picture of the terrain since before he'd taken the controls. It was an old habit, the kind that didn't fully go away no matter how many years you spent trying to live a smaller life. He knew approximately where they were. He knew what was below them, and what was to the north, and what the weather was doing to their options. Working on intentions, he said into the radio. Stand by. Conrad's voice came from behind him, and it was the voice of a man who had decided that the appropriate response to losing control of a situation was to reassert authority over it. There's a regional airport 12 miles southwest, civilian field, long runway. We should divert there. Silas didn't respond immediately. Did you hear me? Southwest. 12 miles. I heard you, Silas said. Then why aren't you... Because the approach path to that field crosses 7 miles of residential neighborhoods with a failing hydraulic system and reduced tail rotor authority. He said it without turning around, without raising his voice, with the particular flatness of a man explaining something he doesn't have energy to argue about. If we lose tail authority on approach over populated ground, we don't get a second chance. The field is off the list. Silence from the cabin. Marcus glanced at him sidelong. There was something in the pilot's expression, not quite recognition, more like the recalibration of an assumption. Like a man realizing the person next to him was playing a different game than he'd thought. You've done emergency approaches, Marcus said quietly. Not a question. Some. What type? Silas adjusted their heading 2 degrees. Degrees, a different type. Marcus absorbed that and didn't push further. 11 seconds passed with nothing but rotor noise and the weather and the sound of Conrad breathing through his nose in a way that meant he was composing another objection. There's a military installation, Silas said, partly to Marcus and partly to the approach controller who was still waiting. Beaufort Marine Corps Air Station, north-northwest, roughly 9 miles. Long runway, emergency crews on standby, and the approach path stays over water and open ground. That's a military field, Conrad said. We're a civilian aircraft. They're not going to... In an emergency, civilian aircraft can request military field access. It's not complicated. Silas keyed the radio again. Approach. November Hotel Yankee 7 requesting divert to Beaufort MCAS. Emergency declaration, dual hydraulic degradation. We need emergency services standing by. The controller came back with confirmation inside 30 seconds. The field was notified. Emergency crews were being scrambled. The approach path was clear. From the cabin, Audrey spoke for the first time since the caution light had activated. Her voice was different from Conrad's, not softer exactly, but more controlled, like someone who understood that panic was an option she couldn't afford. How bad is it? Silas considered the question. He was not the kind of man who softened bad news into meaninglessness, but he was also not the kind of man who dumped every technical detail onto people who couldn't do anything with it. The hydraulic system I flagged this morning is failing, he said. Both circuits. We have reduced control authority, which means the aircraft is harder to fly precisely. We have 9 miles to a field with a long runway and people waiting for us. He paused. It's manageable. He said the word Marcus had used 20 minutes ago, and he meant it more than Marcus had meant it, because he'd assessed what manageable actually required and had already started building the approach in his head. What he didn't say was that manageable and easy were not the same word. What he didn't say was that each passing minute was costing them another percentage point on the hydraulic gauges, and that at some point, probably before they reached the field, possibly well before, the system would give up its last pressure entirely, and he would be flying a machine that weighed over 5,000 kilograms through degraded visibility with pure mechanical input and no margin for error. He'd done hard things before. He'd done things that made this look like a training scenario, but he'd done those things as a younger man, with a team, with the understanding that his existence was a professional variable rather than someone's entire world. June didn't have a backup. That thought crossed his mind and he set it aside, the way he'd learned to set things aside when he needed all of himself for what was in front of him. But it crossed his mind. It always crossed his mind. "What's your name?" Audrey asked. He glanced back briefly. "Corbett. Silas Corbett." "You know what you're doing, Silas." It wasn't a question and it wasn't flattery. It was an observation delivered in the tone of someone who had been watching him work for 3 minutes and reached a conclusion. "Working on it," he said. Conrad made a sound that was almost a laugh. "He's a maintenance technician, Audrey. He's not a..." "Conrad." Her voice cut him off cleanly. "Stop talking." The silence that followed had its own quality. Silas didn't examine it. He had a helicopter to fly. The weather thickened around them as they crossed back over the coastline, heading north-northwest, the water below going from blue-gray to flat pewter as the cloud ceiling pressed down. The vibration in the airframe had gotten worse over the past 5 minutes. Not dramatically, not yet, but consistently, the way a building crack gets worse when you're not looking at it. He could feel it in the cyclic, in the pedals, in the way the aircraft was beginning to resist his inputs rather than respond to them. Marcus was watching the gauges with the focused attention of a man who understood exactly what each number meant and was determined not to let his face show how he felt about them. System 2 at 44, Marcus said quietly. Copy. Rate's accelerating. I know. Marcus was quiet for another few seconds. Then, at current rate, we're going to lose meaningful tail rotor authority before we reach the field. I know that too. So what? I'm going to fly the approach without depending on full tail authority. Silas said it in the same tone he'd used to explain a tool change. We'll come in with forward speed, no hover, touch and slide, long runway. Marcus looked at him. You've landed a helicopter without hover before. Run on landing, yes. On what? A different kind of field. Marcus didn't ask what kind of field. Something in the way Silas said it communicated that the answer would have required a longer conversation than the moment allowed. In the back, one of Conrad's associates, the note-taker, a young man named Price, who had not said a single word since the caution light, had his hands pressed flat against his thighs and was staring at the back of Silas's seat like it was the only fixed point in the universe. The other associate, a woman named Deb, had found the emergency brace position instructions laminated to the back of the forward bulkhead and was reading them with the careful attention of someone who understood that preparedness and panic were different things and was choosing the former. Conrad was gripping the armrest of his seat. He wasn't talking anymore. That, Silas thought without satisfaction, was at least something. Audrey was watching Silas's hands on the controls. She'd been watching them for several minutes, not anxiously, not the way someone watches something they can't affect, but with the focused attention of someone trying to understand what she was seeing. His hands were steady. Not rigid steady, not the performance of steadiness, but genuinely calm. The kind of calm that comes from having made peace with a very specific category of difficult situations. Not because they don't matter, but because falling apart is simply not an option you've left yourself. She noticed something else. He'd taken something from his jacket pocket a few minutes ago, small, wooden, about the size of a poker chip, turned it once in his fingers and slipped it back. He hadn't looked at it. It was the kind of gesture so habitual the person doing it doesn't know they're doing it. She didn't ask about it. The radio crackled. November Hotel Yankee 7, this is Beaufort Approach. Emergency services are in position. Runway 21 is clear. Winds 240 at 12, gusting 18. You are cleared direct approach. Report field in sight. Beaufort Approach. November Hotel Yankee 7, Wilco, Silas answered. We're going to need the runway length. We'll be coming in fast with no hover. Understood. November Hotel Yankee 7. Crash and fire is positioned. The word crash moved through the cabin like a current. That's standard language, Marcus said to the cabin without being asked. They always say that. It was technically true. It was also only half the story, but Marcus was a kind man, and he delivered the half that was useful. System 2 at 37, Marcus said to Silas, his voice dropping below what the cabin could hear. Silas nodded once. They were 6 miles out. The field was not yet visible through the weather, but he knew where it was. He'd been mentally triangulating their position against the terrain features below, the river bends, the highway interchange, the water tower that had emerged briefly through a gap in the clouds 2 minutes ago. Military training built a particular kind of spatial awareness, the ability to construct and maintain a mental map from fragmentary information, and that training didn't fully leave you. It lived somewhere below conscious thought, waiting. Silas, Marcus's voice was very quiet now. Yeah. Your shoulder's bleeding. Silas glanced down. He'd caught the edge of the forward console at some point during the initial turbulence. He hadn't registered it as pain exactly, more as a secondary sensation he'd filed away. And the sleeve of his jacket had a dark stain spreading from the elbow. It didn't concern him. It wasn't the arm he needed. It's fine, he said. You didn't feel that? I felt it. You didn't react. I was busy. He adjusted the collective a fraction. I'm still busy. Marcus said nothing more about it. 4 miles. The cloud ceiling was sitting around 800 feet, which wasn't terrible but wasn't comfortable. The base of the clouds was ragged and uneven, patches of slightly better visibility alternating with thicker gray. Below them, the landscape had shifted from residential to the scrubby flatlands that bordered the military installation. Open ground, wide and forgiving of things going wrong in ways that residential neighborhoods were not. That had been the calculation. That was why he'd chosen this field. "I can see the runway lights," Marcus said. Silas saw them a second later. A double row of white and green at the edge of his forward visibility, solid through the haze. "Buford approach. November Hotel Yankee 7, field in sight. Beginning final approach. November Hotel Yankee 7, you are cleared to land. Emergency services are standing by. Wind check, 245 at 14. Silas keyed the radio once in acknowledgement and then set it aside mentally, because what happened in the next 3 minutes would not be determined by radio communication, and he needed everything he had for the aircraft. "Cabin," he said, loud enough to carry. "Brace positions. Hands in your laps or gripping armrests. Feet flat. We're going to land hard and fast, and we're going to slide. Stay in your seats until we stop completely. Do you understand?" A collection of voices from behind him said yes, or something that functioned as yes. Conrad's was among them. The hydraulic system chose that moment to give its final surrender. The pressure on both gauges dropped to single digits simultaneously, not gradually, not by increments, but in one sudden capitulation, as if the system had been holding on by will rather than physics, and had finally exhausted it. The cyclic went from sluggish to raw mechanical input, and the aircraft wobbled, a sickening, uncontrolled yaw to the left that lasted about 2 seconds before Silas countered it with pedal input and body English, and the kind of muscle memory you don't develop without doing things most people never do. Audrey made a sound, not a scream, more a sharp, controlled intake of breath. Conrad said something that was not a complete sentence. Silas said nothing. He was working. The runway was ahead of them, maybe a mile and a half, the lights running straight and clear through a momentary gap in the weather. The aircraft was descending. He was controlling the descent through the collective, but without hydraulic assist, the inputs required double the force, and his arms were burning, and the shoulder that had been bleeding was now also complaining about what was being asked of it. He kept both hands on the controls and kept his breathing regular and stopped thinking about everything except the geometry of the approach. Angle, speed, rate of descent, lateral drift. 300 feet. The aircraft was shaking, not violently, but constantly, a fine tremor that communicated the absence of the systems that normally damped such things. 200 feet. He could see the crash trucks on the taxiway parallel to the runway, their lights strobing through the haze. "Airspeed," he said. 42 knots, Marcus said. Too fast for a normal approach. Exactly right for a run-on with no hover authority. He was going to touch the runway moving forward, let the skids absorb the vertical impact, and then ride out the deceleration. The math worked if the lateral drift stayed manageable. The math worked if the tail rotor retained just enough authority to keep them tracking straight until touchdown. A lot of things had to work. 100 feet. He found himself thinking, not consciously, more in the way a background process runs, about June sitting at the kitchen table that morning with her spelling list, her pencil moving in the deliberate way she had, her tongue pressed lightly to her upper lip when she was concentrating. She'd been on necessary. She always forgot the double S. The runway threshold came under them. He eased the collective down. The skids touched the runway at a forward speed of 31 knots and a descent rate that was higher than ideal and lower than catastrophic. The aircraft struck hard enough that Silas's teeth came together and his vision jolted. And then the skids were running on concrete and the helicopter was sliding and yawing slightly right, and he was on the pedals and then off them because there was nothing left to give. And the friction of 5,000 kilograms of metal on a concrete runway was doing the physics now. They slid. They turned 4 degrees to the right. They stopped. The rotors were still turning. The master caution panel was screaming amber across every circuit. One of the cabin windows had developed a crack from the impact. Outside, the crash trucks were already moving. For approximately 2 seconds, nobody in the helicopter made a sound. Then Marcus Deller exhaled, a long, shaking exhalation that had been compressed somewhere in his chest for the last 12 minutes, and said very quietly, "Good landing." "That was not a good landing," Silas said. "We're on the ground and we're alive. By my scoring system, that's good." Silas loosened his hands from the controls. His palms left damp impressions on the grips. The shoulder was actively hurting now, the adrenaline receding enough to let the pain through. He rotated it once, carefully, and determined it was functional. Behind him, in the cabin, he could hear Deb saying something to Price in a low, compressed voice. He could hear Conrad, who had gone very quiet, which was a different kind of noise. And he could hear Audrey Hawthorne, who had gotten out of her brace position and was now sitting with her hands clasped in her lap and her head slightly bowed, not praying. He didn't think it was that, but doing something private and necessary that he had the decency not to look at directly. The crash crew reached the aircraft. Voices outside, knocking on the fuselage door, radios crackling. Silas reached across and shut down the fuel flow, the way you were supposed to, the way he'd been taught in a different life on a different kind of aircraft. He sat back. Through the cracked windscreen, the military airfield spread out in all directions. The flat, pragmatic geometry of a working installation, the hangars, the control tower, the line of aircraft parked in disciplined rows. Emergency lights strobed across the wet concrete. 2 more vehicles were coming from the direction of what looked like a station house. It looked, in an abstract way, like places he used to know. He hadn't thought about those places in a long time. Or rather, he'd thought us about them the way you think about weather you lived through. Aware that it happened, aware that it shaped things, not inclined to stand in it again. The door opened from outside. A young airman in a flight suit reached in, took in the scene with the quick, trained assessment of someone who ran toward emergencies for a living, and said, "Anyone injured?" "Pilot has a shoulder injury," Silas said. "Cabin passengers should be assessed. I'm functional." The airman looked at Silas's arm. "Sir, you're bleeding." "I know. Pilot first." The airman looked at him with a brief, slightly different expression. Not quite recognition, more like the registration of a type. The way people who work in certain environments sometimes recognize without knowing they recognize. More personnel arrived. The cabin door was being worked from outside. Marcus was being helped from his seat, carefully, with the particular attention trained people give to shoulder injuries. Conrad was on his feet, talking. Of course he was talking, the return of his voice apparently coinciding with the return of solid ground beneath him. Silas stepped out onto the flight line. The air was cool and damp, the cloud ceiling still low, the smell of aviation fuel and wet concrete and something like burned rubber from the skids mixing together in the way smells always mixed at airfields, specific and slightly chemical and oddly familiar. He stood for a moment beside the aircraft, looking at it. The skids were warped from the landing. One was bent visibly inward at the forward attachment point. There was a long, dark scar on the underside of the fuselage where the concrete had argued with the machine. He'd need to write all of it up. Detailed incident report, sequence of events, system failures, control inputs, approach parameters. He was already composing it in some part of his brain that apparently didn't get days off. Corbett, he turned. A man in a flight suit was walking toward him from the direction of the station house, and something about the walk was familiar before the face was. A particular cadence, slightly formal, the kind of movement pattern that gets built in over years. The man stopped 6 feet away and looked at him with an expression that was partly disbelief and partly something else. "Silas Corbett," the man said. "What in the hell?" Silas looked at him for 2 full seconds, fitting the face to a memory that was more than a decade old. "Lieutenant Commander Ferris. It's Commander now. Has been for 4 years." Ferris looked him up and down. The worn jacket, the blood on the sleeve, the maintenance tech insignia. "You brought that aircraft in?" "Yes, sir." "In that condition? Without hydraulics?" "Run on. Long runway helped." Ferris shook his head slowly. Not in disbelief, in something closer to recognition. "You haven't changed a bit. You look terrible, and you're underplaying everything." "I'm fine." "Your arm is bleeding." "People keep telling me that." Ferris almost smiled. "We've got a medic. Come on." He started walking, and then stopped and turned back and said more quietly, "It's good to see you, Silas." "Even like this?" Silas looked at him. "You too, sir." He hadn't expected that. He hadn't expected any of this. Not the field, not Ferris, not the way the morning had unwound from a routine inspection into something that had required everything he'd spent years trying to set aside. He followed Ferris toward the station house, and he didn't look back at the helicopter. Behind him, at the aircraft door, Audrey Hawthorne had stepped down onto the flight line and was watching the exchange between Silas and the commander, watching the posture shift, watching the recognition that passed between them, watching the way Ferris had stopped and said something that clearly meant something. She was putting it together. The way Silas had moved in the cockpit, the way he'd shut down Conrad's objections without raising his voice. The way he'd made decisions with the confident precision of someone who had made hard decisions under worse conditions many times before. The things she'd felt in the cabin, not safety, exactly, but the presence of genuine competence in a moment when that was the only currency that mattered. She'd assumed he was simply skilled. She was beginning to understand that skilled wasn't the word. She stood on the flight line in the thin mist, the crash truck's light strobing orange across the wet concrete, and watched Silas Corbett walk away from the aircraft he had just brought home. She didn't say anything yet, but she didn't stop watching. The medic's name was Corporal Huang, and she worked with the efficient, no-nonsense competence of someone who had patched up people in worse condition than Silas Corbett, and had long since stopped being surprised by the variety of ways the human body could be damaged and still remain operational. She cleaned the gash on his forearm, assessed the depth, decided it needed 4 stitches and not the 6 she'd initially estimated, and applied them without ceremony while Silas sat on a metal folding chair in the station house anteroom and held his arm steady. "You can feel that," she said. It wasn't a question. She was watching his face. "Yes. Most people flinch. I'm aware." She tied off the last stitch and reached for the gauze. "The shoulder's going to bruise badly. Nothing structural, but you're going to feel it for a week." "I'll manage." "You say that like you've had worse." Silas didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. Huang gave him a look that said she'd noticed, taped the gauze in place, and told him to keep the arm dry for 48 hours, which they both understood was a suggestion rather than an expectation. Through the anteroom door he could hear the controlled noise of the station house beyond, radio traffic, the particular acoustics of a military facility at a heightened operational tempo, voices moving between professional calm and the slightly elevated register of people who had not expected their Tuesday morning to involve a civilian emergency landing. He'd heard that register before, many times, in buildings similar to this one, though those buildings had been in different countries, and the emergencies had been of a different character entirely. Commander Ferris appeared in the doorway while Huang was gathering her supplies. "Investigator from the FAA regional office is on his way," Ferris said. "Base commander wants to speak with you as well. And the passengers from your aircraft are in the ready room." He paused. "One of them has been asking for you." "Which one?" "The woman. Hawthorne." Silas tested the movement of his stitched arm, flexed and extended, functional. He stood. "There's also a situation developing," Ferris said, and the way he said situation carried the particular weight of someone who was being diplomatic about something that didn't deserve diplomacy. "The other passenger, the one in the suit, has been talking to his people on the phone. Apparently he's preparing some kind of statement." Silas looked at him. "Conrad Vane." "That the name? He told our duty officer he intends to formally contest the chain of events as they've been reported." "Of course he does." "Silas." Ferris stepped closer and his voice dropped into the register of something more personal, less official. "I've been in this business a long time. I know what a controlled emergency landing looks like, and I know what an uncontrolled one looks like. What you brought in out there, that was controlled. Barely, and not comfortably, but controlled. Anyone who was on that aircraft and tries to say otherwise is going to have a problem with the physics." He held Silas's gaze. "I just want you to know that." "Thank you, sir." "Stop calling me sir. You've been out long enough." Silas almost smiled. "Old habit." He walked through the station house and found the ready room at the end of the main corridor. A standard military briefing space, functional and spare, with a long table, metal chairs, a whiteboard that still had yesterday's flight schedule on it. Marcus Deller was seated at the far end with his injured arm in a temporary sling, being attended to by a second medic. His face had the yellowish quality of someone operating significantly below their pain threshold, but managing it through determination rather than medication. He caught Silas's eye across the room and gave a single nod, the kind of nod that carries more than acknowledgement. Silas nodded back. Price and Deb were seated together on one side of the table. Price looked like a man who had recently discovered something fundamental about his own relationship with mortality and was still processing the data. Deb had her notebook out and was writing in it, which Silas recognized as a coping mechanism rather than professionalism, though it happened to also be professional. Conrad was not in the room. Audrey was standing at the window on the far side, looking out at the flight line. The crashed helicopter was still visible on the runway. They'd tow it clear once the investigation team arrived to document it in position. In the flat gray light of the overcast morning, it looked like what it was: a machine that had been pushed to the end of its capability and had not quite failed completely. She turned when Silas came in. She didn't say anything immediately. She looked at the gauze on his arm, at the way he was carrying his shoulder, at his face. Then she said, "Sit down." "I'm fine standing." "I'm sure you are. Sit down anyway." He sat down, which surprised him slightly. He wasn't accustomed to taking directions from people in situations he'd just navigated, but there was something in her voice that wasn't authority exactly. It was more like the reasonable expectation of someone who had just watched him hold an aircraft together through sheer physical and mental will for 12 minutes and had decided he'd earned the right to be told to rest without arguing about it. She pulled a chair out from the table and sat across from him. The table between them was government-issue laminate, scarred and practical. She put both hands on it, flat, and looked at him. "Who are you?" she said. "You know my name." "I know your name is Silas Corbett, and you work for my company as an avionics specialist, and you have a daughter named June." She said it evenly, without accusation. "I don't know who you actually are." He held her gaze. "What did Ferris tell you?" "Nothing directly, but he shook your hand on the flight line and called you by your last name only, and then went back inside and came out again about 4 minutes later and shook it again, which suggests that in between those two handshakes he confirmed something that made the first one feel insufficient." She paused. "Military installations don't usually respond to civilian emergency landings by sending a commander out to personally escort the pilot inside." Silas was quiet for a moment. From the other end of the table, Marcus was saying something to the medic about his range of motion, and Price was staring at the whiteboard, and Deb was still writing. "Former Navy SEAL," Silas said. He said it quietly, without preface or decoration, the way you state a fact that used to define you and no longer does. Audrey absorbed it. Her expression didn't dramatically shift. She wasn't the kind of person whose face ran ahead of her thoughts, but something behind her eyes settled, like a piece of information that had been waiting for its context. "How long?" 12 years of service, 8 of those in active SEAL teams, the last 4 in aviation specialized roles, combat search and rescue, helicopter assault operations, advanced avionics qualification. He said it the way someone reads from a file they've memorized through repetition. "I left 6 years ago." "Why?" He looked at her. "You don't have to answer that," she said. "My wife died," he said. "Aneurysm. No warning. June was 3 years old." He said it plainly, the way you describe a fact that has been so thoroughly processed over so many years that the processing itself has become routine, though the fact at the center of it never actually becomes smaller. "I was on deployment when it happened. By the time I got back—" He stopped, started again. "I had a 3-year-old who barely knew my face, who'd been staying with my mother-in-law for 2 weeks, waiting for me." He was quiet for a moment. "I put in my separation papers 4 months later." The ready room was not silent. There was Marcus and the medic, the radio traffic bleeding in from the corridor. But the noise had the quality of background, the way sound becomes irrelevant when 2 people in a room are paying full attention to each other. "You walked away from a 12-year career," Audrey said. "I walked towards something else." Most people would say that's not how careers work. Most people don't have a 3-year-old looking at them like they're a stranger. She was quiet for a moment. "And the work you do now? The avionics, the inspections. That's not—" She searched for the word settling. "For you." "No. You chose it specifically." "I chose it because I'm good at it, and it keeps me close to machines I understand, and it gets me home by dinner most nights." He said it without apology. "It's not nothing." "I didn't say it was." "Conrad implied it was." A muscle moved at the corner of her jaw. "Conrad implies a lot of things," she said. "Some of them are wrong." Outside the ready room window, 2 vehicles had arrived on the flight line. One with government markings, one a Hawthorne Dynamics corporate car, that must have come down from wherever Vane had arranged it. Silas watched the car without expression. "He's going to try to make this about me," Silas said. "I know. He's going to say I took unauthorized control of the aircraft, that my concealed military background raises questions, that my actions may have worsened the situation." "I know," Audrey said again. "He called his attorney 40 minutes ago. I could hear him through the wall." Silas looked at her steadily. "And where do you stand?" She didn't look away. "I watched you this morning, on the tarmac, before we boarded. I watched you hand that form to Ray, and I watched Conrad dismiss you like you were furniture." She paused. "I didn't do anything. I told myself I had reasons, and I did have reasons, but the honest version of those reasons includes the fact that I was thinking about the acquisition meeting and not about whether you were right." She said it with the directness of someone who had made a habit of being honest with herself, even when it was uncomfortable. "So I owe you something, an apology at minimum." "You don't owe me an apology for Conrad Vane's decisions." "No, I owe you one for mine." She held his gaze. "I saw you standing there with that form, and I chose to trust the system instead of the person who was actually touching the machine. That was wrong." Silas was quiet. He appreciated honesty. He was not always sure what to do with it when it arrived unexpectedly. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me. It's just accurate." She straightened. "Now, what do we need to do to make sure the record is straight?" And that was the moment. Not the landing, not the emergency, not even the conversation that had just happened. When Silas Corbett decided that Audrey Hawthorne was not the person he'd assumed she was when she'd stood at the edge of the tarmac that morning and said nothing. He pulled his chair closer to the table. "First thing," he said, "the grounding recommendation I filed this morning, both copies, the terminal log, and the manufacturer's portal backup. Those need to be secured before anyone with access to the terminal system has reason to go looking for them." She nodded. "I'll call our general counsel." "Second, Marcus Deller's account of the cockpit sequence needs to be documented while the details are current. He's going to be the most credible voice on what actually happened up there, and Conrad is going to try to muddy that." "Marcus is going to be fine," Audrey said, with the quiet certainty of someone who had already assessed that. "He's not the type who rewrites history." "Third," Silas paused, "the physical evidence on the helicopter, the hydraulic lines, the actuator assembly, the pressure sensor logs. That's going to tell its own story to anyone who knows what they're looking at. The FAA investigator will find it. I just need to make sure they know what to look for." "Can you walk them through it?" "That's what I'm here for." The door opened. Conrad Vane came in. He'd managed, in the 40 minutes since the landing, to straighten his jacket and reassemble the surface of his authority. Though underneath the surface, something had clearly shifted. There was a tension in his posture that hadn't been there this morning, a careful watchfulness, like a man who's been told the room is being recorded and is now measuring everything he does against that possibility. He looked at Silas first, then at Audrey, then back at Silas. "I need to speak with Audrey privately," he said. "Sit down, Conrad," Audrey said. "This is a personnel matter, and it needs to be—" "It's not a personnel matter. It's an aircraft investigation, and Silas is part of it. Sit down." Conrad's jaw tightened. He pulled a chair from the far end of the table and sat, which was the physical action of compliance combined with the facial expression of someone who intended to dispute the legitimacy of the instruction later. "I've been in contact with our legal team," he said. "I want it on record that the cockpit situation this morning was irregular. A maintenance technician taking control of an executive aircraft without authorization. The authorization was implicit," Marcus said from the end of the table. Everyone looked at him. The medic had stepped back. Marcus had his good arm resting on the table and was looking at Conrad with the patient, slightly tired expression of a man who had spent 20 years dealing with difficult passengers and had concluded that directness was more efficient than tact. "I transferred control to Corbett," Marcus continued, "verbally, in the cockpit, with the required acknowledgement. That's a valid transfer of aircraft command authority, and I'll state that in front of any investigator who asks." He paused. "Additionally, my shoulder was sufficiently compromised that I could not have safely managed the approach. If Corbett hadn't been there—" He stopped, apparently deciding he didn't need to finish the sentence. Conrad looked at him for a moment. Then he redirected, the way a man redirects when one avenue closes. "The question of his qualifications are on file," Silas said. "The FAA requires that I maintain a current airman certificate. I do. The certificate covers rotary wing aircraft. He met Conrad's eyes without particular heat. You can verify it. You didn't disclose. I'm an avionics specialist. My previous military service wasn't relevant to my employment position. There was no requirement to disclose it and no mechanism to do so. He said it flatly, the same way I didn't disclose that I coached youth soccer for 3 years. Some things are background, not credentials. Deb, who had not stopped writing since Silas had entered the room, pressed her lips together in a way that might have been suppressed amusement. Conrad shifted. He was not done. Silas could see that. But he was recalibrating. The easy avenues were closing. He needed something, and he was looking for it with the slightly frantic efficiency of a man who has spent his career finding angles and is discovering that the current geometry doesn't have any good ones. Grounding recommendation, Conrad said finally, and his voice was different now, so flatter, more careful. You said you filed it. There's no record in the terminal log of a grounding hold. The room went quiet in a particular way. Silas looked at him. Conrad continued, his voice finding something closer to confidence as he pressed the point. I checked before we boarded. The terminal coordinator confirmed it. There was a notation in the system, but it was listed as a technician's advisory, not a formal grounding hold. That's a different Conrad. Silas said his name without a title, without formality, and the sound of it brought the man to a stop. Do you know why I use the manufacturer's maintenance portal backup? A beat. What? The terminal system can be accessed by Hawthorne Dynamics administrative personnel. The manufacturer's portal is an independent server. Authentication is through the maintenance certification database, not the corporate network. It records who accesses it and when. It can't be altered by anyone without Hawthorne clearance because it doesn't communicate with Hawthorne systems at all. He let that sit. I've been using it for 8 months, partly because I've seen terminal logs get corrected before, partly because I prefer documentation that stays where I put it. Conrad said nothing. The backup record from this morning, Silas continued, will show the time I submitted the grounding recommendation, the specific hydraulic anomalies I flagged, my technician certification number, and the timestamp on the submission. He paused. It will also show the acknowledgement receipt. The portal generates an automatic acknowledgement when a grounding recommendation is submitted for a registered aircraft. That acknowledgement goes to the registered aircraft operator's safety contact on file. He held Conrad's gaze. Which is you. The temperature in the ready room dropped approximately 4 degrees. Marcus was looking at the table. Price had stopped pretending to look at the whiteboard. Audrey had gone very still. Conrad's face did something complicated. A rapid sequence of expressions that passed too quickly to fully read, but that collectively communicated the experience of a man watching a floor he was confident was solid, develop a crack that ran from one wall to the other. That's, he started. The FAA investigator will pull the manufacturer's portal records as part of the standard accident investigation, Silas said. It's routine procedure. They'll see the recommendation, the timestamp, and the acknowledgement receipt. I may not have... Conrad stopped. Started again with a different approach. These things come through as automated notifications. There are dozens of them. It's not reasonable to expect that every... You personally cleared the aircraft for departure, Audrey said. Her voice was quiet and even, and it was much more dangerous than if she'd raised it. Audrey, I'm asking you to confirm something I already know the answer to. Did you personally authorize departure after receiving a hydraulic grounding recommendation? Conrad looked at her. He looked at Silas, he looked at Marcus, who was looking at the table, and at Deb, who was still writing, and at Price, who had apparently decided that the ceiling was the safest place to direct his gaze. The schedule, he began. Stop, Audrey said. He stopped. The word had the quality of a door closing rather than a command being issued. Whatever conversation Conrad Vane had been planning to have, with his attorneys, with the board, with the press contacts he'd presumably already considered, that conversation had just become significantly more difficult, and the room understood it before he fully did. Audrey looked at him for a long moment. Her face was controlled but not blank. There was something behind her eyes that was not anger exactly, but was what comes after anger when a person realizes the thing they were angry about was actually much larger than they thought. We'll talk later, she said to Conrad. Not here. He stood, straightened his jacket, walked to the door with the careful dignity of a man who has not yet accepted that dignity is no longer his to maintain. He paused with his hand on the door frame. For the record, he said without turning around, I made a judgment call. Senior executives make judgment calls. That's what we're employed to do. Nobody answered him. He left. The room held itself together for about 4 seconds, and then Price exhaled so audibly that Deb put her pen down and looked at him, and Marcus shifted carefully in his chair, and Silas stood and walked to the window. The flight line was busy now. The FAA vehicle had parked near the helicopter. 2 men in government-issue jackets were walking around the aircraft, photographing it. One of them crouched and looked at the skids, which told Silas the man knew what he was looking at. Ferris was out there too, talking to someone near the crash trucks, his posture easy and authoritative in the particular way of a person completely at home in their environment. Behind Silas, Audrey came to stand near the window. Not next to him, a few feet to his left, at enough distance that it wasn't pointed, just proximate. I'm sorry, she said quietly, for this morning. You already said that. I know. I wanted to say it again without the table between us. She looked at the helicopter, at the investigators moving around it. He received the notification. Yes. He knew. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. People could have died. Yes. He knew that was a possibility, and he authorized the flight anyway, because we had a meeting. She said it the way people say things they are still in the process of fully believing, as if hearing the words out loud helps. Because the schedule was, in his mind, the risk was acceptable, Silas said. He made a calculation. He's made 1,000 similar calculations, and most of them worked out because hydraulic seals usually hold. He watched the investigator photograph the bent skid. This one didn't. Audrey turned to look at him. I was still looking at the flight line, at the ruined helicopter, at the investigators building the factual record of the morning piece by piece. You're very calm about this, she said. I'm not calm. I'm controlled. What's the difference? Calm means it doesn't affect you. Controlled means it affects you and you manage it anyway. He turned from the window. June is 9 years old. Her mother is gone. I am the only constant she has. Falling apart is not something I've left myself room to do. Audrey looked at him for a moment. Something in her face shifted, not to pity, which would have been wrong and which Silas would have recognized and disliked, but to something quieter. Understanding, maybe, or something adjacent to it. Do you miss it? She asked. The military. He considered the question. He'd been asked variations of it before, by people who expected either, no, I don't miss it at all, or yes, every day, both of which were unsatisfying because they were both partially true in different ways, and neither was fully accurate. I miss being good at something difficult in a context where it mattered, he said. I don't miss what it cost. He paused. Avionics is good work. It's not a consolation prize. I know, she said, and the way she said it suggested she actually did. Through the window, the lead FAA investigator, a heavy-set man with a gray beard and the economical movements of someone who had been doing this for 30 years, had crouched near the hydraulic access panel on the helicopter's underside and was shining a light into it. He'd found something. Silas could tell from the way the man's posture changed, the slight forward lean, the second investigator being called over. They'd found the actuator failure, or the line fracture, or both. Whatever the physical evidence was, it was there, and it was consistent with everything Silas had documented at 6:40 that morning, and it was going to tell its own story in ways that Conrad Vane's attorneys were going to find very difficult to argue with. The morning had been terrible and necessary and was not finished yet. But the evidence was being found, and the record was intact, and Silas was standing on solid ground. He reached into his jacket pocket and touched the wooden disc, June's name on one side, his on the other, and then pulled his hand back out. There was a debrief to get through, a statement to give, a report to write. The investigator with the gray beard was going to want to speak with him, and Ferris was going to want to speak with him, and the base commander was apparently going to want to speak with him, and somewhere in the middle of all of that, Audrey Hawthorne was going to have to start making decisions about what came next. Silas was not thinking about any of that quite yet. He was thinking about the spelling list on the kitchen table, about the way June pressed her pencil to the paper, about the fact that necessary has 1 C and 2 S's and she always mixed them up, and that he'd been helping her with it every evening for 2 weeks. He was thinking about the promise he'd made that morning. The afternoon was still ahead of him. He turned from the window and went to find the investigator with the gray beard. The FAA investigator's name was Bernard Okafor, and he had the particular quality of stillness that develops in people who spend their careers reconstructing the sequence of events that lead to catastrophe. He wasn't dramatic about it. I didn't lead with authority or press hard on soft spots the way investigators in television procedurals did. He simply asked questions in a steady, unhurried voice and listened to the answers with the focused patience of someone who understood that the truth was almost always in the details people didn't think to mention. He met Silas in a small office that Ferris had made available off the main corridor. 2 chairs, a metal desk, a window that looked out at a row of parked aircraft rather than the crash site, which Silas suspected was deliberate. Okafor set a digital recorder on the desk between them, stated the date, time, location, and the names of those present, and then looked at Silas with an expression that said he was ready whenever Silas was. Silas started at the beginning. He walked through the pre-flight inspection, the specific readings, the anomalies in lines 1 and 3, the inconsistency he'd heard before he'd seen the data confirm it. He described the grounding recommendation, the terminal log entry, the manufacturer's portal backup. He described Conrad Vane's dismissal on the tarmac, the way the flight had proceeded over his formal objection, and the moment he'd been unexpectedly placed aboard the aircraft he'd tried to ground. Okafor listened without interrupting. He made occasional notes in a small pad, not transcribing but flagging. His expression remained professionally neutral throughout, which was different from indifferent. He was tracking everything, filing it against whatever picture he was building. The manufacturer's portal backup, Okafor said when Silas finished. You described this as a personal habit rather than standard procedure. Correct. How long have you been using it? 8 months. Why did you start? Silas was quiet for a moment. I flagged a brake assembly issue on a different Hawthorne aircraft last spring. When I followed up, the terminal log showed my notation had been downgraded from a maintenance hold to a technician's advisory. The brake assembly was serviced 2 days later. The repair tech found the same issue I'd flagged, and his report documented it as newly discovered. He said it without heat. The portal backup creates a record outside the corporate system. I started using it after that. Okafor wrote something in the pad. Not a quick notation, a longer one. Was that earlier incident formally reported? I raised it with the maintenance coordinator. I was told the log change was a clerical error. Did you accept that explanation? I started using the backup portal, Silas said. That's my answer. Okafor looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not quite appreciation, but was something in that direction. He made another note. They moved through the flight itself. The pressure readings, the weather, Marcus's shoulder injury, the transfer of control, the approach. Silas described each decision point and the reasoning behind it. He described the choice of Beaufort over the civilian field, and why. He described the run-on landing technique, what it required, what it risked, what made it the appropriate choice given the available runway length and the absence of hydraulic assist. At no point did he frame any of it as heroic. He described it as a sequence of technical decisions made under time pressure with degraded equipment, which was what it was. Did you consider, Okafor said carefully, that taking control of the aircraft without the passenger's explicit knowledge might itself create risk? Control of the aircraft without the passenger's explicit knowledge might itself create risk? The passenger's explicit knowledge wasn't relevant to the physics of the situation. What mattered was whether I had the qualifications and the authorization from the pilot in command. I had both. He paused. Marcus Deller transferred control. He was the pilot in command, and it was his authority to transfer. He made the right call. You didn't hesitate. No. Most people in your position, a maintenance specialist on a civilian aircraft, not acting in any official flight capacity, would have hesitated, or would not have had the capability. I wasn't most people in that position, Silas said, and I knew it, so hesitating would have been a choice to let other people pay for my discomfort about stepping forward. Okafor studied him. You've described yourself throughout as a former SEAL with aviation specialization. Can you confirm your current FAA certification status? Airman certificate, rotary wing instrument rating maintained current. Certificate number is on file with the FAA Airman Registry. He said the number from memory and watched Okafor write it down. We'll verify that. He set the pen down. One more question, and this one is less formal. In your assessment, And I want your technical assessment, not your opinion of the personalities involved. Could this emergency have been prevented? Silas considered the question the way he considered things he'd already thought through extensively, which meant he considered it briefly. The hydraulic system showed measurable anomalies during pre-flight. A bench inspection would have identified the failure point before flight. Yes, it could have been prevented. He met Okafor's gaze. It should have been prevented. Thank you, Okafor said. He clicked off the recorder. Then, in a different register, slightly less official, slightly more human, he said, I've been doing this 22 years. I've interviewed a lot of people about a lot of incidents. He capped his pen. The physical evidence on that aircraft is going to be consistent with everything you just told me. I'd stake 22 years on it. He stood and extended his hand. That's not part of the record. Silas shook it. Understood. He walked back into the corridor and found Ferris waiting near the water fountain with 2 cups of coffee, one of which he held out without comment. Silas took it. How'd it go? Ferris asked. Fine. Okafor's good, one of the better ones the regional office has. Ferris sipped his coffee. Vane is in the conference room down the hall with his attorney. They've been in there 90 minutes. I'm sure they have a lot to discuss. His attorney arrived about 40 minutes ago, drove down from Charleston. Ferris looked at the wall rather than at Silas, which was how certain conversations happened between certain kinds of men. The attorney asked Okafor for a copy of your statement before Okafor had finished taking it. Okafor told him the investigation was ongoing and referred him to the FAA press office. Silas drank his coffee. It was institutional grade, the kind that existed in every military facility he'd ever been in, hot and strong, and built for function rather than pleasure. The portal backup, Ferris said. Does Vane know about it? He knows I mentioned it. Whether he understands what it means is another question. What does it mean? It means the acknowledgement receipt exists. The portal generated it automatically when I submitted the recommendation. It went to Vane's registered safety contact email. Silas turned the cup in his hands. His attorney is going to find that out inside the next hour, probably less. Ferris was quiet for a moment. When his attorney finds that out, he said slowly, things are going to get more complicated before they get simpler. Yes. Are you prepared for more complicated? Silas thought about it. I've been prepared for more complicated since 6:40 this morning. Ferris almost smiled. He looked at Silas the way people look at someone they knew in a different context, trying to reconcile who that person was with who they are now. Not judgmentally, just trying to update the picture. You look different, he said, from before. I am different. Not worse different, just... He seemed to search for it. Quieter, like you made peace with something. I made a choice, Silas said. Making peace with it came later. Ferris nodded. He understood the distinction. How's the daughter? She's 9. She's in her spelling bee phase. God help her. She's better at it than I was. Silas finished the coffee. I need to find a phone. I should have called her school before now. Use the office. Second door on the left. Ferris took the empty cup from him. I'll find out what Okafor's timeline looks like. You're going to need to stick around for the preliminary incident summary. Silas nodded and walked to the second door on the left, which turned out to be a small administrative office unoccupied at the moment, with a desk phone and the particular quiet of a room that wasn't used for anything urgent. He sat down, pulled the chair to the desk, and dialed the number for June's school from memory. The school secretary's name was Mrs. Paulson, and she had been the school secretary since before June had been a student there, which meant she'd been doing the job since before Silas had been a single father, and she treated the parents who called midday with the patient, slightly weary care of someone who understood that adults calling schools in the middle of the morning usually had a reason. Mr. Corbett, she said, is everything all right? There was an incident at work. I wanted to let you know I may be late picking June up. I'm trying to arrange coverage. Of course. Shall I let her know? He thought about it. June was 9. She knew what his job involved in the vague way children knew such things. She didn't know about his military background, or not in any detailed way. She knew he'd served, the way children knew parents had jobs before the jobs they had now, as background rather than foreground. Tell her I'm running late and I'll call her directly once I know more, he said. Tell her I haven't forgotten about spelling practice. A pause. Is she going to worry? Silas considered this. The honest answer was that June worried about things in the careful, methodical way she did everything. She would file the information, assess it, and monitor for updates rather than spiraling immediately. That was her nature. "She'll be fine," he said. "She's tougher than she looks." He hung up and sat for a moment in the quiet of the office. His arm throbbed dully under the gauze where the stitches were. His shoulder was beginning to manifest the deep muscular soreness that the medic had predicted. The coffee had been terrible, and it helped anyway. He thought about the acknowledgement receipt in the manufacturer's portal. He thought about Okafor's recorder and the 22 years behind the man's eyes. He thought about Conrad Vane in the conference room down the hall, and the attorney who had driven from Charleston, and the particular quality of desperation that entered a powerful person's decision-making when they began to understand that the options they normally relied on were not available in the current situation. Powerful people who ran out of legitimate options sometimes reached for something else. He stood up and went back into the corridor. Audrey was there. She was leaning against the wall outside the ready room, phone to her ear, and when she saw Silas, she held up a finger, 1 minute, and finished the conversation with something clipped and conclusive that sounded like the end of a legal discussion. She lowered the phone. "Our general counsel secured both copies of the grounding recommendation 30 minutes ago," she said. "The terminal log entry and the portal backup, both time-stamped, both intact." "Good." He also confirmed that the portal acknowledgement receipt exists and was delivered to Conrad's registered email at 7:03 this morning. She said it without expression, but there was something underneath the neutrality, the particular flatness of a person describing a fact that is both confirmation and indictment. "Conrad received it at 7:03. We boarded at 9:17. 2 hours and 14 minutes, Silas said. "Yes." They stood in the corridor for a moment. From down the hall, behind the conference room door, there was the low murmur of a conversation that was not audible but was clearly not comfortable. "His attorney contacted our general counsel 10 minutes ago," Audrey said. "They want to discuss the possibility of a private resolution before the FAA preliminary report is filed." Silas looked at her. "What does that mean?" "It means they know what the preliminary report is going to say, and they'd prefer to manage it before it becomes public." She met his gaze. "It's not going to happen. I want you to know that." "I wasn't going to ask you to. I know you weren't. I'm telling you anyway." She straightened. "Conrad made a decision that could have killed 5 people. That's not something you manage privately." She said it with the clean, certain quality of someone who had thought it through and arrived at a conclusion they weren't going to revisit. "The board is going to be informed by end of day. The full facts. Not a managed version." Silas nodded. She looked at him for a moment. "You're not relieved," she said. "I thought you'd be more—" "I'm not worried about Conrad," he said. "The evidence is what it is. I'm more concerned about Marcus." He paused. "He was flying an aircraft that shouldn't have been in the air. His shoulder is hurt. He's going to face questions about why he agreed to fly over my recommendation." Audrey's expression shifted, a quick acknowledgement that she hadn't fully considered this dimension. Marcus had no authority to override a vice president's clearance decision. "No, but that won't stop someone from suggesting he should have tried harder." Silas shook his head slightly. "He's been flying for 20 years. He did everything right this morning. He handed the controls to someone who could manage it, and he stayed calm and he supported the approach. He doesn't deserve to carry any part of this." "I'll make sure our legal team covers him," she said. "Make sure it's not conditional on anything." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean, make sure his coverage isn't tied to his account of events being consistent with what's convenient for Hawthorne Dynamics. It should be because it's the right thing to do." She held his gaze for a long beat. "You don't trust easily." "I trust specifically," he said. "There's a difference." The conference room door opened. Conrad Vane came out first, followed by a man in a gray suit who had the careful, minimal affect of an attorney who had spent the last 90 minutes managing a situation he hadn't expected. Conrad looked at Audrey, then at Silas. His face was composed in the particular way of a man who has not fully accepted what's happening, but has been advised by counsel to control his expressions. "Audrey," he said, "I'd like a private conversation." "We can talk in the ready room," she said, "with Silas present." "That's not—" "It is." She turned and walked toward the ready room, and the flatness in her voice was such that both Conrad and his attorney followed. In the ready room, Marcus had been moved to a chair near the window, his arm in a proper sling now, his face carrying the pale, slightly glazed quality of managed pain. Price and Deb were still at the table. They looked up when the group came in, and then looked at the table again, with the instinct of people who understood they were witnesses to something they hadn't signed up for. Conrad sat at one end of the table. His attorney sat beside him. Audrey sat across from them. Silas stood near the wall to the side. Not theatrically, just practically, in a position where he could see everyone in the room. "I want to address the grounding recommendation," Conrad said. He'd assembled some version of composure, the kind that comes from coaching rather than genuine calm. "My position is that the notification was received but was assessed in the context of a full review of the aircraft's maintenance history. The aircraft had been certified." "Conrad," Audrey's voice was quiet, "I'm not your opposing counsel. You don't need to give me a position. I need you to tell me what actually happened." The attorney touched Conrad's arm lightly. Conrad reset. "I reviewed the notification at 7:03. I also reviewed the maintenance certification records. Based on those records, I made a judgment that the advisory could be assessed after the flight rather than before." He said it carefully, with the precision of someone reading from an internal script that had been constructed in the last 90 minutes. The certification record showed a full hydraulic service completed 6 weeks ago. "A 6-week-old service doesn't address an anomaly that appeared on pre-flight this morning," Silas said. "I'm not a maintenance technician," Conrad said. "I made a reasonable assessment based on available information." The available information included a formal grounding recommendation from the certified specialist who had physically inspected the aircraft 2 hours before departure, which I assessed in context. Conrad. Audrey said his name once more, and something in it stopped him completely. "Do you understand what a grounding recommendation actually is? In legal terms? In regulatory terms?" A pause. The attorney was keeping his face professionally neutral with some effort. "It's a formal maintenance hold document," Audrey continued. "When a certified avionics specialist files a grounding recommendation against a registered aircraft, that aircraft cannot be legally cleared for departure by a non-licensed personnel. You are not a licensed airman. You are not a certified maintenance supervisor. You had no regulatory authority to clear that aircraft." She let that sit. "The FAA investigator is going to find this within the next 48 hours. Our general counsel has already found it. I'm telling you now because you've worked for this company for 9 years, and you deserve to hear it from me directly before you hear it from an investigator or a board of directors." Conrad looked at the table. His attorney started to say something. Audrey held up a hand without looking at him. "People could have died," she said. "I want you to understand that. Not theoretically. Actually. Silas was on that aircraft, and Marcus was on that aircraft, and I was on that aircraft. And you knew about the recommendation and you cleared the flight because we had a meeting." She paused. "The meeting, for what it's worth, has been postponed indefinitely. The acquisition partners were informed this morning that there was an incident." Conrad lifted his eyes. He looked at Silas with an expression that was complex in the way that losing men's expressions sometimes are. Not simple anger, not simple shame, but a mixture of both, along with something that was probably recognition, that recognition had come too late. "You could have said something else," Conrad said. "On the tarmac. You could have made it clearer." Silas looked at him. "I handed you a form." "You could have—" "I handed you a form," Silas said again, without raising his voice, without moving from the wall. It said grounding recommendation in the header, in 14-point type. I explained the anomaly in plain language. I told you what I'd found and what it meant. You told me in front of the ground crew that my assessment wasn't meaningful." He paused. "What I could have done differently is not a conversation I'm willing to have." The room was very quiet. The attorney said something to Conrad in a low voice. Conrad nodded slightly, the nod of a man receiving instructions he's too tired to dispute. He stood. "I'll cooperate with the investigation," he said. It came out flat, like a decision rather than a promise. "I know you will," Audrey said. He walked out. The attorney followed. The door closed behind them with a sound that was not a slam, but had the same quality of finality. Price was staring at the table. Deb had put her pen down. Marcus, from the window, let out a slow breath. "Well," Marcus said. Nobody responded to that because it covered everything. Audrey looked at Silas across the room. Her face was tired in a specific way. The tiredness of someone who has spent the day doing difficult things correctly and has not found it satisfying, which is its own kind of exhaustion. "Thank you for being here," she said. "In the room. I needed—" She stopped, rethought. "I wanted you in the room." "I know," he said. "I'm going to call the board chairman in about 10 minutes. After that, things are going to move quickly, and it's going to be, I don't know, complicated. Media, probably. Board emergency session." She rubbed her face briefly with both hands, a gesture that was so human and unguarded that it shifted something in the room. "I haven't dealt with anything like this before." "You handled the room fine," Silas said. "I've handled worse negotiations. This wasn't a negotiation." She lowered her hands. "This was a reckoning." He couldn't argue with that. Okafor found him an hour later in the corridor, carrying a tablet with what appeared to be a preliminary incident summary. He wasn't sharing it, it wasn't ready to share, but he held it in a way that communicated he'd been building it from what the aircraft had told him, and the aircraft had told him quite a lot. "The actuator on hydraulic line 1 failed at the secondary seal," Okafor said, "consistent with the anomaly pattern you described from pre-flight. The fracture shows oxidation at the failure point that indicates the seal had been degrading for some time, possibly weeks." He looked at Silas steadily. "Whatever you heard during that pre-flight inspection was real. The physical evidence confirms it." "I know it was real." "I know you know." Okafor tucked the tablet under his arm. "I'm telling you anyway, because sometimes it matters to have someone official say it." He paused. "The acknowledgement receipt is going to be central to the regulatory action. I want you to know that I consider your conduct throughout this incident to be entirely consistent with proper safety practice. That will be in the preliminary report." Silas nodded. "Marcus Deller's conduct as well." "Goes without saying." Okafor turned to go, then stopped. "That run-on landing, angle, speed, the choice of field. I went over your inputs with the base safety officer. He agrees it was the correct approach given the conditions." He paused. "He also said he's only seen that technique executed correctly a handful of times." Silas said nothing. "Where did you learn it?" Okafor asked. "A different kind of field," Silas said. It was the same answer he'd given Marcus. It was still the accurate one. Okafor studied him for a moment, then nodded once in the way people nod when they've decided not to push a door that isn't going to open, and walked away. The afternoon moved in the particular way that afternoons move when a crisis has passed its worst point but has not finished. There were more conversations, with Ferris, with the base commander, a brief video call that Audrey arranged in which Silas was asked to confirm 2 specific technical points for the Hawthorne board chairman in real time. He confirmed them. The chairman was a man in his mid-60s named Schofield, who listened carefully and asked better questions than Silas had expected. When the call ended, Audrey closed the laptop and sat for a moment. "Schofield is convening an emergency board session tomorrow morning," she said. "Conrad is suspended pending investigation, effective immediately." She said it with the weight of something that would have meant more to her under different circumstances. She and Conrad had worked together for 3 years, and whatever their differences, that kind of history didn't vanish without leaving something behind. "It's the right call." "Yes," Silas said. "It doesn't feel clean." "It's not clean, it's correct. Those aren't always the same thing." She looked at him. "You say that like you know it from experience." "Most things I know come from experience." Outside, the light was changing, the overcast thinning in the west, suggesting the weather was finally moving through, the pale late afternoon quality of a sky that might clear by evening. The helicopter was still on the runway, marked with orange cones, waiting for the investigation to finish before anyone moved it. It would be transported eventually, inspected thoroughly, its components examined and documented, and some of them retained as evidence. It had tried to fail completely and had not quite managed it. Silas understood that feeling. He was standing near the window again, the same window where he'd stood that morning watching the investigators, when his phone buzzed in his pocket. Not a call. A text. From the number he'd called the school from earlier, forwarded through the school's system. It was from June. "Mrs. Paulson said you're running late. That's okay. Don't forget we have the double S words tonight." He read it twice. Necessary. Possession. Assassin. She'd sent the list. Of course she had. 9 years old, and she'd thought to send the list because she knew he'd want to prepare. He typed back. On my way as soon as I can. I didn't forget. He put the phone in his pocket and turned from the window. There was still a statement to sign off on and a preliminary report to review and a conversation with Ferris that had been interrupted twice and not finished. There was the drive back to Savannah. There were about 14 things that required his attention before he could leave, and he went about addressing them in the order they needed to be addressed. With the same focused efficiency he'd applied to everything else since 6:40 that morning. But underneath all of it, steady and quiet as a correctly functioning hydraulic system, was the single clear thought that had been there since the moment the skids had touched the runway. He was going home. He'd promised. And Silas Corbett did not make promises he didn't intend to keep. The statement took 40 minutes to finalize, which was faster than Silas had expected and slower than he'd hoped. The FAA form was 12 pages, technical and precise, and Okafor walked through it with him section by section, reading each of Silas's responses aloud before accepting them into the record. It was careful, methodical work, the kind Silas was good at and didn't resent, even at the end of a day like this one. Precision mattered, especially now, especially with Conrad's attorney in the building looking for any gap between what the evidence said and what the witnesses reported. He signed the last page at 4:17 in the afternoon. Okafor collected the forms, added them to a folder that already held what looked like a substantial preliminary report, and shook Silas's hand again. "We'll be in contact over the next few weeks as the investigation develops," he said. "You may be asked to provide additional technical clarification." "I'm available," Silas said. "I know you are." Okafor paused at the door. "For what it's worth, and I understand this isn't the kind of thing that makes a day like this feel better, what you did out there was exceptional. Not just the landing, the whole morning, the documentation, the backup protocol, the way you handled the cockpit." He looked at Silas steadily. "Most people don't get to see what happens when someone who genuinely knows what they're doing makes every correct decision under impossible conditions. I got to see it today." Silas didn't know what to do with that, so he said thank you in the minimal way he said things like thank you, and Okafor left. The corridor was quieter now. The afternoon had moved on. The base was returning to its normal rhythm, the kind of institutional steadiness that military facilities maintained regardless of what happened around them. Because the mission didn't pause for drama. Silas found Ferris near the entrance, jacket on, ready to wrap up. "You're free to go," Ferris said. "Okafor cleared your departure. You'll need to arrange transport back to Savannah. Your company vehicle is still at the terminal." "I'll call a car." "I can have someone drive you." "I appreciate it. I'll call a car." Ferris looked at him for a moment. There was something he wanted to say. Silas could see it, the slight forward lean, the breath that preceded a sentence rather than just air. He let it come. "I always wondered," Ferris said, "what you'd end up doing after you separated." He said it without judgment, with the particular quality of honesty that surfaces between people who knew each other in difficult circumstances and haven't spoken in years. "I heard you went maintenance. I wasn't sure what to make of that." "What do you make of it now?" Ferris looked at the flight line through the glass door. The helicopter was still visible, still marked with cones, the investigation ongoing. "I make of it that you were exactly where you needed to be," he said. "Today. On that tarmac at 6:40, and in that cockpit, and in this building. Every part of it." He turned back. "Whatever the path looked like from the outside." Silas thought about that. He thought about the way paths looked from the outside. The maintenance jacket, the beat-up truck, the anonymous competence of a man who showed up every day and did what needed doing without making it a performance. He thought about how much of a life could be invisible to the people who never thought to look. "Look, June's got a spelling test next week," he said. Ferris blinked, then laughed, an actual laugh, surprised out of him. "That's what you're thinking about right now." "She's been working on the double S words for 2 weeks. I'd hate for her to get it wrong because I wasn't home to practice." "Then go home, Silas." They shook hands. It lasted a moment longer than formal handshakes did, the extra second that meant something. He was pulling out his phone to arrange a car when Audrey found him. She was still in her work clothes, the same she'd worn on the helicopter that morning, a gray blazer over a dark blouse, now carrying the accumulated weight of a day that had included an emergency landing, a board call, a confrontation, and whatever the conversation with the chairman had taken out of her. She looked tired. She looked like a person who had been thorough and correct all day, and hadn't found it particularly satisfying, which was the honest face of doing difficult things right. "I was hoping to catch you before you left," she said. "I'm right here." She glanced at the phone in his hand. "I won't keep you long." She looked down the corridor toward the doors, then back. "I want to talk to you about something, and I want to do it now because I've been thinking about it for about 3 hours, and if I wait until things settle down, I'm going to second-guess myself." He put the phone away. "There's no version of tomorrow," she said, "in which Hawthorne Dynamics functions the way it has been. Conrad is suspended, and the board investigation is going to confirm what the FAA investigation confirms, which means his position is gone. That part I've accepted." She said it with the particular flatness of a thing that is both right and painful simultaneously. "What I'm left with is a company that has a serious problem, not just in terms of what happened today, in terms of why today was able to happen at all." Silas listened. "We don't have an independent aviation safety function," she said. "We have a safety compliance office that reports up through operations, which reports through Conrad. What that actually means, in practice, is that safety decisions have been getting filtered through the same people who have scheduling priorities and budget pressures." She paused. "You documented an anomaly 8 months ago, and it got downgraded in the terminal log. You don't know how many times that happened to someone else who didn't use a backup portal." "I don't," he said, "but I suspect it wasn't once." "No." She held his gaze. "I need to fix that. Not just the process, the structure. I need a safety function that reports directly to me and has unqualified authority to ground any aircraft in our fleet on any maintenance specialist recommendation without being overridden by anyone in operations or executive management." She paused. "And I need someone to build it and run it." He was quiet for a moment. "That person would need to understand the technical side completely," she continued, "but they'd also need to be able to function at a strategic level, working with regulators, setting internal standards, building a culture where the person closest to the machine is always the first voice in the room." She watched him. "I think you understand what that requires better than anyone I could recruit from outside." Silas looked at the floor for a moment, not to avoid her gaze, to think, which was what he did when he thought. "What's the structure?" he asked. "Direct report to me. Independent budget, unilateral grounding authority. You staff it how you need to staff it." She said it without the inflated language of corporate job descriptions, just the actual terms. "It would mean leaving the maintenance floor. You'd still be near the aircraft, but in a different capacity." "Salary?" She named a number. It was considerably more than he made. He didn't react to the number the way she might have expected. "I have a condition," he said. "Tell me." "The authority to ground an aircraft can't be contingent on executive approval. It has to be unilateral, documented, and legally protected. If a technician, any technician, not just me, files a grounding recommendation, that aircraft stays grounded until the safety function clears it, not until an executive decides they've waited long enough." He met her eyes. "I want that in writing, in the company safety charter, not as a policy that can be quietly amended, as a structural requirement." She didn't hesitate. "Done." "And Marcus Deller gets a commendation in his personnel file for his conduct today. Not conditional on anything, before the end of the week." "Already planned," she said. "What else?" He thought. "Nothing else." She looked at him steadily. "You're not going to negotiate the salary?" "The salary is fine. Most people would—" "I'm not most people," he said. "You said that, you understand it. The structure matters more than the number." He paused. "June is 9. She needs me home at a reasonable hour most evenings. The job has to accommodate that." Audrey's expression did something that was not quite a smile, softer than that, more considered. "You can work it around school hours," she said. "That's not a problem. Then I accept." She extended her hand. He shook it, not the way he'd shaken Ferris's hand, which had been between people with a shared history, but the way you shake a hand when you're agreeing to something that matters, both of you aware that the handshake is a small gesture standing in for a large one. "Monday," she said. "We'll make it formal." "Monday," he agreed. She didn't immediately let go of the handshake. She held it for one extra second, the way Ferris had, and then she did, and she stepped back, and there was something in her face that Silas chose not to examine too closely, because it was the end of a very long day, and he had a car to call and a daughter to get home to. "Silas," she said, as he pulled out his phone again. He looked up. Today, she said. What you did. Not just in the cockpit. The whole thing. The form, the backup portal, the choices you made about which field, what to say to Conrad, what to say to Okafor. She paused. I've worked with a lot of people in high-pressure situations. I've seen how people behave when the margin gets thin. She said it with the careful honesty of someone making a considered statement rather than a compliment. You were the best version of what a person can be in a difficult situation. I want you to know that I saw it. He looked at her for a moment. I was doing my job, he said. The job I tried to do at 6:40 this morning. It just took a few extra steps to get there. She nodded. She understood the thing he was saying beneath what he was saying, which was that heroism was a word other people applied after the fact, and that from the inside it mostly felt like a sequence of decisions made quickly with insufficient information in conditions that weren't of your choosing. He called the car. It would arrive in 20 minutes. He went back to the small office where he'd called the school and sat for those 20 minutes doing something he rarely allowed himself to do, which was simply sit. His arm ached. His shoulder ached. The day had the particular weight of days that require everything you have across a sustained period, not the sharp, immediate demand of a single crisis, but the cumulative load of hours of sustained concentration and controlled emotion and precise decision-making in conditions designed to destabilize all three. He was tired. Not broken tired. Just genuinely, honestly tired, in the way that meant the things he'd done had cost something real. He took the wooden disc out of his jacket pocket, June's name on one side, his on the other. She'd made it in art class in second grade, some project involving balsa wood and paint pens. And she'd given it to him on a Tuesday morning when he'd been running late and looking stressed, pressing it into his hand and saying, with the particular matter-of-fact generosity of a 7-year-old, that it was so he'd have something to hold on to if he needed it. He'd been carrying it every day since. He held it for a moment in the quiet of the empty office, the base going about its evening business around him, and then he put it back in his pocket and stood up. The car was a plain sedan driven by a man named Earl, who had the radio on low and no particular interest in conversation, which suited Silas exactly. The drive back to Savannah took an hour and 20 minutes, through the tail end of the weather that had caused the morning's trouble, the sky ahead of them clearing into the pale orange of a coastal sunset, the highway mostly empty in the direction they were traveling. Silas called June's school to confirm she'd been picked up by his neighbor, Carol Briggs, who had June on a standing emergency contact, and who had picked her up exactly twice before, both times for work situations, and once for the time Silas's truck had a blown tire on the highway and he'd been stranded for 90 minutes. Carol was 63, retired from the postal service, and had a particular affection for June that she expressed by teaching her card games and complaining about her spelling list in a way that was clearly affectionate rather than critical. June was fine. Carol confirmed it in the brief, efficient way Carol confirmed things. June had eaten a snack, had started her homework, and had asked Carol twice whether her dad had called yet. He texted June from the car. On the way home, be there by 7:30. Her response came back in under a minute. Okay, Carol taught me gin rummy. I beat her twice. He read it twice. Then, that's my kid. June, she said you taught her gin rummy and you never beat her. Silas, I let her win. June, she said you'd say that. He put the phone away and watched the highway for a while, the sedan moving steadily through the gathering dark, and he felt the day begin to decompress in him. Not drop away, because it wouldn't drop away for some time. There was too much yet to resolve, too much to build, too many conversations ahead. But settle. Find its place. Become something that had happened and been survived rather than something still happening. He thought about what Audrey had said. He thought about the structure she'd described, the independence of it, the authority, the direct line of accountability. He thought about what it would mean to build something from nothing and have it actually function the way it was supposed to create the conditions in which the person closest to the machine was always the first voice heard rather than the first voice dismissed. He thought about the technician who had flagged the brake assembly last spring and had his notation quietly downgraded. He didn't know that technician's name. He knew what it felt like to be that technician. There were other Silas Corbetts out there, so not with his specific background, not with his backup protocols and his particular stubbornness, but people who saw what needed to be seen and wrote it down and handed it to someone and watched that person look through them rather than at them. People whose warnings got downgraded to advisories. People who boarded aircraft they'd tried to ground because the schedule said so, and the man in the $5,000 suit said so. And the system was built to make saying something louder than speaking up cost more than it was worth. That was the thing he could change. Not the whole world of it, not the industry, just this company, these aircraft, these people. That was enough to be worth doing. He got home at 7:23. The house was a rental, a small two-bedroom on a quiet street in a part of Savannah that was neither fashionable nor neglected, just steady and real. The kind of neighborhood where people knew their neighbors' vehicles and left each other more or less alone. He'd rented it when June was 5 because the school down the street had a good reputation, and the backyard had a tree she'd immediately declared she wanted to climb, and the tree was still there, and June had mastered it 2 years ago, and now used it mostly as a reading spot on good afternoons. Carol's car was in the driveway. The kitchen light was on. He'd barely turned off the engine when the front door opened. June came out in her socks. No shoes, because she was 9, and the concept of appropriate footwear for outdoor surfaces had not fully taken hold. And she came down the porch steps with the particular run of a child who has been told someone is coming home and has been watching the window for the last 20 minutes. He got out of the car, and she hit him at approximately waist height, both arms wrapping around him with the total physical commitment of a small person who is extremely glad to see someone. His shoulder protested sharply. He didn't make a sound. He put both arms around her and held on. "You're late," she said into his jacket. "I know. I'm sorry. Carol taught me gin rummy." "I heard. She said you beat her." "Twice." She pulled back and looked up at him. She had her mother's eyes, dark, very direct, not easily fooled. She looked at his face the way she always looked at his face when he came home from difficult days, with the focused attention of a child who had learned early that adults didn't always tell you when things were hard, but that their faces sometimes did. "What happened to your arm?" He looked down. The edge of the gauze was visible below his sleeve. He'd forgotten to roll it down. "Small cut," he said. "It's been taken care of." "How small?" "4 stitches." "That's not small." "It's handled, June." She studied him for another moment with those eyes that didn't let things go easily. Then she took his hand, the arm without the stitches, and said, "Come inside. I made you keep the spelling list." "I know. You texted it to me." "So you could prepare," she said, as if this were obvious. He let her lead him up the porch steps and into the kitchen, where Carol was sitting at the table with a cup of tea and the particular expression of a woman who had been expecting him and was satisfied that he'd arrived. She looked at his arm, then at his face. "Rough day," she said. It wasn't a question. "Manageable," he said. The word had accumulated a specific weight over the course of the day. She stood, gathered her jacket from the back of the chair. June ate 2.5 portions of the pasta you left in the fridge. She claimed she was only having 1, but I watched her go back twice. "I was hungry," June said, without particular defensiveness. "You're always hungry." Carol touched Silas's arm lightly as she passed him. A brief, uncomplicated contact that meant she'd noticed the gauze and wasn't going to make a production of it. "Call me if you need anything." "Thank you, Carol." "That's what neighbors are for." She went out. The kitchen settled into its evening quiet. June had already put her spelling list on the table with a pencil beside it, organized and ready. Silas hung his jacket on the hook by the door and sat down, and June sat across from him and picked up the pencil with the focused preparedness of someone who had been thinking about this moment since approximately 7:03 that morning. "Okay," she said. "Start with necessary." He smiled. Not a big smile, just the small, real one that appeared when things were where they were supposed to be. "Spell it." "Necessary." She said each letter clearly, without hesitation. 1 C, 2 S's. "Correct." She looked pleased in the way she looked pleased when she got something right. Not triumphant, just satisfied, a quiet click of correctness. "Possession." "Spell it." "Possession." She paused after the second S cluster. 2 S's twice. "Correct." "I kept mixing up the middle part," she said. "I kept wanting to put only 1 S in the second cluster." "What helped?" She thought about it with the genuine seriousness she brought to problems. "I thought about it like a pattern. SS pause SS, like 2 pairs." She tapped the pencil on the table. Does that make sense? It makes complete sense. Do you have a trick for it? Same as yours, he said. Pairs, your brain found the right way. She looked at the list. Okay. Assassin. He watched her work through it. Assassin. Slow and deliberate, her tongue pressing to her upper lip the way it always did when she was concentrating. She got it right. She looked up. You're not going to ask me about your arm, she said. It wasn't a question. You asked me about it outside, he said. You didn't really answer. He looked at his daughter, 9 years old, sitting in the kitchen light with her spelling list and her pencil, watching him with those eyes that had learned too early to look carefully. He thought about what to tell her and how much, and he decided, as he usually decided, on the honest version calibrated for what she could actually use. There was an emergency at work today, he said. A helicopter I was on had a mechanical problem. We had to make an emergency landing. Everyone is okay. She absorbed this. Her face went through several things quickly. The recognition of something serious, the assessment of whether he was downplaying it, the landing on the fact that he'd said everyone is okay and he was sitting here, so that appeared to be true. Were you scared? She asked. I was focused, he said. Scared and focused feel similar. The difference is what you do with it. She considered that. What did you do with it? My job, he said. I did my job. She looked at him for another moment. Then she nodded, the nod of someone who has decided to accept an answer because it's the honest one rather than because it resolves everything, which was a form of trust that Silas understood was not automatic and not small. Okay, she said, and looked back at her list. Broccoli. That's not a double S word. I know, but I can never spell broccoli either. He laughed. It came from somewhere real, the unexpected release of it, the particular joy of being surprised into laughter by a 9-year-old at the end of a day that had tried hard to contain nothing worth laughing about. Broccoli, he said. She wrote it down. 2 C's, she muttered. Everything has 2 of something. They worked through the list, 22 words, the double S cluster, and a handful of others she'd flagged as troublesome. And it took about 40 minutes, with occasional detours into why English spelling was so inconsistent, and whether it was anyone's fault specifically or just accumulated historical accident, a conversation that June had strong opinions about and that Silas found he genuinely enjoyed having. At 9 o'clock, he told her it was time. She gathered her list and her pencil and stood, then stopped. Dad. Yeah. The emergency today. She held the pencil loosely in both hands, the way she held things when she was thinking about something more than she was talking about it. Were you the one who handled it? He looked at her. I helped. Were you the most important person who helped? He was quiet for a moment. I was the person who was in the right place with the right experience, he said carefully. That's different from important. She thought about this with the focused attention she brought to things that mattered to her. I think that's the same thing, she said. Being in the right place and knowing what to do. I think that's what important means. He had no argument for that. She went to bed. He sat at the kitchen table for a while after, in the quiet of the house, with the spelling list and the pencil she'd left, and the particular stillness that settles into a home when a child is asleep in it, and the day's worst has passed and you find yourself still present, still functioning, still here. He thought about what June had said. The right place with the right experience. He thought about the 16 years he'd spent becoming someone who could do what he'd done that morning, 12 in service, 4 building a different kind of life around the same underlying person, and how none of it had felt like preparation while it was happening. It had felt like living, making choices. Some of them good and some of them costly, and all of them pointing, by paths he hadn't planned, toward a Tuesday morning on a tarmac in Savannah where a machine spoke to him and he listened. He thought about the people who didn't listen, not because they were evil, though some of them were careless in ways that amounted to the same thing, but because listening required you to take seriously the voice of the person you'd already decided didn't matter. That was the harder thing. Not the technical knowledge, not the physical capability. The willingness to hear what someone is telling you before your existing opinion of them tells you whether it's worth hearing. Conrad Vane would face a board investigation. He would face the FAA's findings. He would face, eventually, the full accounting of what his decision had cost, and nearly cost. That process was underway and Silas had no control over it and found he didn't want control over it. The system, imperfect as it was doing what it was supposed to do. The evidence would speak. That was enough. What mattered, the thing that would outlast the investigation, the disciplinary action, the industry headlines that Okafor had delicately implied were coming, was the structure that came after. The safety division. The charter. The unilateral grounding authority that couldn't be overridden by anyone with a schedule and an executive title. The next technician who found something wrong and put their name on a form would have a structure behind that form that hadn't existed before. That was the thing worth building. Not because it fixed everything, because it fixed something real for real people. In ways that were specific and verifiable, and not dependent on someone having a hidden Navy SEAL background and a backup portal, and the particular stubbornness that came from having decided a long time ago that certain things were not negotiable. Most people didn't have any of that. They just had the form and the courage to sign it. They deserved a system that honored that. His phone rang at 9:47. He expected it to be nobody important. A notification, a work system alert, something administrative from the day's aftermath. He looked at the screen. It was Marcus Deller. He answered. Marcus. Silas. The voice was tired but present, which meant the pain medication was calibrated right. I'm home. Wife picked me up an hour ago. She's... A pause. She's doing the thing where she pretends to be calm, but she's not calm. That's reasonable. Yeah. Another pause. I wanted to call while I was thinking about it, before I went to sleep and before it got processed, I guess, turned into a story. He was quiet for a moment. What you did in that cockpit today. The transfer. I made the right call giving it to you, but I want you to know I knew I was making the right call. It wasn't panic. I could feel you on those controls before I handed them over. Silas listened. I've been flying 21 years, Marcus said. I've had 3 emergency situations, nothing like today. And in all of it, I've never... He stopped, started again. I've never handed an aircraft to someone and felt them take it the way you took it, like it was already yours. His voice was careful, like someone measuring what they say against what they mean. I don't know who you used to be. I have a better idea now than I did this morning. But I know who you are. And I wanted to say it wasn't lost on me. Silas looked at the kitchen table, at the spelling list June had left, at his own hands, rested flat on the wood, the gauze on the forearm, the hands that had held the cyclic through 12 minutes of failure and weather and the narrow arithmetic of survival. Thank you, Marcus, he said. How's the shoulder? The MRI says it's a partial tear. Surgery next week. I'm going to be out for 6 weeks minimum. A beat. Apparently they're starting an investigation into how I got cleared to fly an aircraft that had a grounding recommendation on file. They won't find anything on you. I know that. Doesn't make it comfortable. Another pause. Vein is suspended. Yes. Good. It was said quietly, but with the complete conviction of a man who has thought about what happened to his shoulder and why, and has concluded that quiet conviction is the appropriate response. You'll be called for the FAA investigation, Silas said. Okafor is thorough. He'll make sure your conduct is properly documented. That's something. Marcus exhaled, a long, releasing breath. I should sleep. I just wanted to say it. I'm glad you did. Take care of that arm. Take care of the shoulder. I will. A pause. Hey, Silas? Yeah. Your daughter, June. He said the name carefully, like someone who has heard it mentioned and wants to get it right. She's lucky. Silas was quiet for a moment. That works both ways, he said. After he hung up, he sat for a while longer in the kitchen quiet. Not thinking, exactly. More allowing the day to be what it had been. Terrible and necessary, and not without cost. Allowing the decisions to be what they were, not clean or heroic, but correct, made with the information available, at the speed the situation required, in the direction he'd pointed himself years ago when he'd chosen the life that brought him here. He would call Audrey's office Monday morning and begin the work of building something that mattered. He would write the incident report, his full technical account, detailed and precise, and submit it as part of the FAA record. He would check on Marcus's surgery date and make sure the commendation reached his personnel file before the week was out. There were things to do, structures to build, a company to make safer than it had been when the morning started. All of that was Monday. Tonight the house was quiet and his daughter was asleep and he had come home. He stood, turned off the kitchen light, and walked down the hall. June's door was half open, the way she slept. Not fully closed, because she'd told him once that she didn't like the idea of her door being all the way shut, in case she needed to hear the house. He stood in the gap for a moment and let his eyes adjust to the dark. She was on her side, one arm around the battered stuffed rabbit she'd had since she was 2, the spelling list still visible on her nightstand, where she'd apparently reviewed it one final time before sleep. Her breathing was slow and even. She'd asked him once, a year ago, whether he was ever scared at work. He told her the truth, sometimes yes. But being scared and doing what needs doing are the same action. You don't wait for scared to go away. You work through it. She'd thought about this for a long time. Then she'd said, "Is that why you're good at your job? Because you don't wait?" He hadn't answered her then. He'd said he wasn't sure, which was the honest version. He was more sure now. He pulled her door to the half-open position it needed to be and walked to his own room at the end of the hall. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his hands one more time. The stitches, the bruising starting to darken on the heel of his right palm, the wear of the day. And then he lay down without changing out of his clothes, because it was nearly 10 and he was too tired for that particular task. He was asleep inside 4 minutes. He did not dream about helicopters. He did not dream about cockpits or Conrad Vane or the runway at Beaufort or any of the things that might reasonably have followed him into sleep. He dreamed, briefly, softly, in the way dreams come when you're too tired for their full machinery, about June at a spelling bee, standing at a microphone, and the word they gave her was necessary, and she spelled it without hesitating, and the sound of it was clean and correct and complete. 1 C, 2 S's. She'd gotten it right. And outside the window of the dream, or maybe outside the window of the actual room, the last of the day's weather had moved on, and the sky over Savannah was clearing, and the stars were out, and Silas Corbett, who had been a SEAL and a widower and a maintenance tech, and a man nobody thought to look at twice, was exactly where he'd promised to be. Home. There are people in the world who are seen and people who are not, and the difference between those two groups is rarely about what they've done or who they are. It's about whether anyone thought to look. Silas had spent years in the second group by choice, not out of bitterness, not because he'd given up, but because the most important audience was 9 years old and needed him present more than the world needed to know his name. The world found out anyway. That's not always how it goes. Sometimes the maintenance tech hands over the form, and it disappears, and the flight proceeds, and everyone lands safely, and the warning gets filed as paranoia. The hydraulic seal holds. The schedule is met. And nobody ever knows the name of the person who tried to stop it. But sometimes the seal fails, and the cockpit needs someone, and the runway is there, and the person who spent years being invisible turns out to be exactly the person the moment required. The lesson in that is not that quiet competence always gets its day. It doesn't. The lesson is that quiet competence is worth maintaining anyway, for the days when it matters, which arrive without announcement, which don't wait for you to be ready, which go badly or go well, depending entirely on whether someone who knows what they're doing is close enough to the machine to hear what it's saying. Silas had been close enough. He'd listened. That was the whole story. The rest? The investigation, the new division, the charter, the gradual work of changing a company's culture from the inside. The rest was the kind of thing that doesn't make a single dramatic morning, but accumulates over years into something solid and real and worth having built. He would do that work. But not tonight. Tonight, June was asleep down the hall with her spelling list on her nightstand, and Silas Corbett had kept every promise he'd made by morning light, and that was enough for one Tuesday in the